The rain fell soft against the tall windows of Clarence's house, a gentle rhythm that seemed to echo the nervous heartbeat of the young woman sitting inside. The room was magnificent, decorated in the soft, elegant tones that spoke of centuries of history, but to Catherine Middleton, it felt both beautiful and terrifying. She smoothed the fabric of her simple dress for the 100th time, hoping her palms would stop sweating. This was the moment she had been dreading since she had fallen in love with Prince William. Today, she would have lunch with his father. William had tried to reassure her during the car ride over, squeezing her hand and telling her not to worry. "Papa just wants to get to know you," he had said with that easy smile of his. But Catherine knew who Charles was. He was not just any father, he was the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, a man whose entire life had been lived under the scrutiny of the world. She had read the books, seen the documentaries. She knew about the complicated history, the marriage to the beloved Diana, and the woman who still seemed to occupy a large part of his heart, Camilla Parker Bowles. Catherine was terrified that Charles would see her as just another ambitious girlfriend, a commoner trying to climb the ultimate social ladder. She was terrified he would judge her family, her background, her very existence. When the door opened and Charles walked in, he was not the stiff, formal figure she had expected. He was shorter in person than he appeared on television, and his eyes, a pale and piercing blue, held a warmth that immediately disarmed her. He smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile that reached the corners of his face. "Catherine," he said, his voice exactly as she knew it from television, but softer in the intimate space of the room. "Welcome. It is so lovely to finally have you here properly." He took her hand in both of his, and the gesture was so paternal, so unexpectedly kind, that she felt a lump form in her throat. William, ever the diplomat, excused himself to take a phone call, leaving them alone. For a moment, there was silence. Catherine waited for the inquisition, for the questions about her intentions or her family's background. Instead, Charles gestured to the window. "Look at that rain. William tells me you are an avid photographer. Have you ever tried capturing London in the rain? And the light does the most extraordinary things against the wet pavement." He spoke not as a prince to a subject, but as one artist to another. He asked about her studies at St. Andrews, not about the grades, but about what she had felt when she looked at the art. He asked about her parents and her younger siblings, expressing genuine curiosity about their business and their lives. He talked about gardening, about the philosophy of architecture, and about the importance of finding a quiet place in a loud world. Catherine found herself relaxing, her shoulders dropping from their tense position near her ears. She spoke about her grandmother, a former flight attendant, and how she had taught Catherine the importance of service. She spoke about her own mother, Carol, and how she had built a business from nothing. As she spoke, or as she watched Charles's face, he wasn't just listening, he was absorbing. He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. There was no condescension, no superiority. He was just a father, getting to know the woman his son loved. By the time William returned, the tension had vanished. Catherine realized she had just experienced something remarkable. The man who had been painted by the press as cold and distant had shown her a warmth she hadn't anticipated. He had seen her, not as a potential princess, but as Kate. And in that moment, a silent bond was forged, one that would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. The years that followed were a blur of public appearances, smiling for the cameras, and navigating the unspoken rules of the House of Windsor. Catherine, now the Duchess of Cambridge, learned quickly. She learned to wave for hours without her arm aching, to make small talk with dignitaries, and to keep her composure when the flashbulbs became blinding. But the most important lesson she learned was about the man she now called her father-in-law. She watched him at countless events, noticing the small things the public never saw. She saw the way he would stoop slightly to hear a nervous young volunteer speak, the genuine concern in his eyes when he visited a hospital, and the almost childlike delight he took in showing off the gardens at Highgrove. However, she also saw the loneliness. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift towards the door, as if looking for someone. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders when the tabloids printed yet another unkind story. She knew the history. She knew that his great love, Camilla, that was still a source of immense public controversy. While the world had softened slightly towards her, there were still whispers, still comparisons to Diana, still a lingering coldness from those who could never forgive him for the breakdown of his first marriage. Charles, for all his privilege, often seemed like the loneliest man in the room. Catherine understood loneliness. She had experienced it herself in the early days of her relationship with William, hounded by the paparazzi, labeled Weighty Katie by a press that seemed eager for her to fail. She knew what it was like to be judged without mercy. So, she made a conscious decision. She would not just be his daughter-in-law, she would be his ally. The first time it happened, it was subtle. At a large family gathering at Balmoral, at the sprawling Scottish estate where the royal family spends the summer, Catherine noticed Charles standing apart from the group, looking out at the misty hills. The rest of the family was inside, laughing and playing games. Without a word, Catherine excused herself from William and the children and walked outside. She stood beside him, not saying a word, just sharing the view. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice quiet. "My grandmother brought me here when I was a boy. She taught me the names of all the hills." Catherine just nodded. "They have a permanence, don't they?" she said softly. "A solidness. It's comforting." He turned to her, and for a moment, the public mask slipped, replaced by a look of profound gratitude. He didn't need to say thank you. His eyes said it for him. From that point on, their bond deepened into something rare within the often stiff confines of royalty. She became his secret weapon at public events. When they appeared together, the dynamic was different. The press photos showed them laughing, their heads close together, sharing private jokes. Body language experts noted her ease around him, the way she would gently touch his arm to guide him, the way he would lean into her space, seeking her warmth. For Charles, who had spent much of his life being told what to do and how to feel, Catherine's natural, unforced affection was a balm. In private, she became the bridge he desperately needed. The relationship between Charles and William had always been complex, marked by the shadow of Diana's death and the natural distance between a father consumed by duty and a son who had witnessed his mother's pain. But Catherine, with her steady gaze and her middle-class magic, gently helped to close that gap. For Charles's 75th birthday, it was Catherine who orchestrated the family portrait, organizing the children and her husband to ensure the image was one of genuine, happy family unity. She took a photograph herself, a stunningly intimate shot of Charles resting his head on William's shoulder. The image spoke volumes. It wasn't just a photo, it was a peace treaty, negotiated and signed by the woman who had become the family's quiet architect. Charles looked at the picture and saw something he hadn't felt in years, the uncomplicated love of his son. He knew with a certainty that warmed him that Catherine was the reason. Then came the day the world stopped. April 9th, 2021. The funeral of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen had lost her beloved husband of 73 years, and the nation mourned with her. But for the family, bound by the strict COVID-19 protocols, the grief was compounded by isolation. They were spaced apart in the chapel, a visual representation of the distance the pandemic had forced upon them all. The images from that day are etched into the public consciousness. The Queen, sitting alone, a tiny, brave figure in black, her face hidden behind a mask. Inside St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the atmosphere was one of profound, suffocating sorrow. Charles, now the heir apparent, walked in the procession behind his grandfather's coffin, his face a mask of duty. But as he took his seat, the weight of the moment crashed down on him. This was not just the loss of a grandfather, it was the loss of a mentor, a confidant, and the last great patriarchal figure of his life. He stared ahead, his jaw tight, fighting the overwhelming tide of emotion that threatened to break the famed royal, stiff upper lip. Across the aisle, separated by the empty pews mandated by social distancing, Catherine watched him. She saw the slight tremor in his hands, the almost imperceptible tightening of his throat. She saw the little boy inside the 72-year-old man, the boy who had lost his beloved grandmother, the boy who was now, in a very real way, an orphan of an era. Protocol dictated that she stay in her seat. Public displays of emotion were to be controlled. Grief was to be private. But Catherine had never been one for cold protocol when humanity was at stake. She glanced at William, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. As the service concluded and the family prepared to leave, Catherine made her move. Ignoring the strict social distancing rules, ignoring the eyes of the world that were surely upon them, she walked directly towards her father-in-law. She placed a gentle hand on his forearm, a gesture of solidarity. Then, as the world watched in stunned silence, she leaned in and pressed a tender kiss to his cheek. In that single, defiant act of love, the entire room fell silent. It was a shock to the system. Here was a woman, not born into this family, breaking its most sacred rule to remind a grieving son that he was loved. For a moment, Charles's composure cracked. He looked at her, his eyes glistening, and in that look was a universe of gratitude. He didn't have to say a word. She understood. She was not just his daughter-in-law. She was his daughter, the daughter he never had, offering the comfort only a child can give. The cameras captured the moment, and the world saw it. They saw the humanity behind the crown. They saw a family, hurting, holding each other up. In that moment, the narrative shifted. No longer was Catherine just the glamorous duchess. She was the heart of the family. And Charles, the often misunderstood king-in-waiting, was seen through her eyes. A vulnerable man, deserving of love and compassion. The years that followed brought new titles and new burdens. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022, Charles became king. It was a moment he had both prepared for and dreaded his entire life. The weight of the crown was heavy, and the loneliness of the throne was immense. In his first address to the nation as sovereign, he stood before the world and spoke of his family. Looking directly into the camera, he spoke of William and Catherine, bestowing upon them the titles of Prince and Princess of Wales. With Catherine beside him, he said, his voice filled with a palpable pride, "Our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know, continue to inspire and lead our national conversations." It was a public anointing, a clear signal to the world that he trusted Catherine implicitly, that he saw her as the future strength of the monarchy. A year later, during a state visit to Kenya, he gave a speech that revealed just how deep his affection for her ran. Standing in the country where his son had proposed, he looked out at the assembled guests and referred to Catherine not as the Princess of Wales, or even as his daughter-in-law, but with two simple, powerful words, "My beloved daughter-in-law." The phrase was tender, paternal, and deeply moving. It was a far cry from the formal language of royalty. It was the language of the heart. But it was in the face of a shared private terror that their bond would be tested like never before. In early 2024, the unthinkable happened. Buckingham Palace announced that the king had been diagnosed with cancer. The news sent shockwaves around the world. Then, just weeks later, Kensington Palace released a video statement. Catherine, the picture of quiet courage, sat on a garden bench and revealed that she, too, was undergoing preventative chemotherapy. The world wept with her. Behind the palace gates, a different kind of battle was being fought. Two patients, father and daughter, bound by blood and by illness. Charles, ever the protector, was reportedly so proud of Catherine for her courage. A palace source revealed that the king had remained in the closest contact with his beloved daughter-in-law throughout the past weeks. They became each other's anchors in a storm of uncertainty. Just before she recorded her brave video message to the world, a quiet, unassuming meeting took place. It was not a grand state event, but something far more important. The King and the Princess of Wales had lunch together. It was a private moment, away from the cameras and the courtiers. We can only imagine the conversation. Perhaps they talked about treatment plans and side effects. Perhaps they talked about the fear of leaving their loved ones. Or perhaps they just sat in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. In that simple meal, and the roles had completely reversed. The nervous young woman who had once been terrified to meet her future father-in-law was now his comrade in arms. They were no longer just king and princess. They were two people fighting for their health, holding hands in the dark, proving that the family you choose to love is often the family that saves you. The years had a way of softening the sharp edges of duty. King Charles III, once a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his stooped shoulders, had found a lightness in his step that surprised even those closest to him. Much of that lightness could be traced back to one person, his daughter-in-law, Catherine. Theirs had become a partnership that transcended the usual family dynamics. She understood him in a way few others did. She knew when to offer a comforting word and when to simply be present. She knew that beneath the robes and the crown beat the heart of a man who felt things deeply, a man who craved connection and understanding. At a state banquet in Nairobi, the king rose to speak. The room was filled with dignitaries, diplomats, and the elite of Kenyan society. It was a formal affair, filled with the usual pomp and circumstance. But then the king deviated from the expected script. He spoke of his son, William, and the moment he had proposed to Catherine. He looked across the room, his eyes finding hers, and he said, "It was here, in sight of Mount Kenya, that my son, the Prince of Wales, proposed to his wife, now my beloved daughter-in-law." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a public declaration of love. It's as potent as any a father could give. Catherine felt a warmth spread through her chest. She remembered that nervous young woman who had once trembled at the thought of meeting him. Now, here he was, calling her beloved in front of the world. It was a full-circle moment that spoke of a journey traveled together, of battles fought side by side. The world saw this bond in countless small gestures. They saw the way the king would blow a kiss to Catherine from across a crowded room, a sweet, private signal in a public space. They saw the way she would affectionately call him Grandpa in front of others, a simple, unroyal nickname that spoke of a warm, normal family relationship. They saw the way he would gently guide her with a hand on the small of her back, a protective, paternal gesture that revealed the depth of his care for her. As in the quiet moments, away from the cameras, their bond was even stronger. They shared a love of the arts, of architecture, of the natural world. They would spend hours walking through the gardens at Highgrove or Balmoral, talking about everything and nothing. He would show her a new tree he had planted, and she would tell him about the latest funny thing Prince Louis had said. They were, in every way that mattered, family. Charles often reflected on his life, with all its trials and tribulations. He thought of the woman he had chosen, Camilla, who had stood by him through the storm. And he thought of the woman his son had chosen. He realized that in the grand, messy, complicated story of his life, Catherine's arrival had been one of the greatest blessings. She had not just married his son, and she had healed his family and captured his heart. The day of the Duchess of Kent's funeral was overcast, the kind of gray London day that seeped into the bones. The service at Westminster Cathedral was somber and dignified, a fitting tribute to a woman who had served her country with grace. The royal family, dressed in black, moved through the rituals with practiced ease. Queen Camilla, unfortunately, had been unable to attend due to illness, leaving Charles to face the solemn occasion without his wife by his side. Catherine noticed. She always noticed. As the service concluded and the family prepared to depart, she saw the slight slump in his shoulders, the fatigue of grief and duty etched onto his face. He looked for a moment profoundly alone. Without a second thought, she acted on instinct. As they gathered in the cathedral's entrance, she stepped towards him. The courtiers froze. The protocol was clear. Public displays of affection were discouraged, especially at formal, solemn events. But Catherine didn't care about protocol. She cared about the man standing in front of her. She reached up and, in full view of the stunned congregation and the waiting press, she planted a gentle, loving kiss on his cheek. The shock in the room was palpable. A few gasps could be heard. But then, something magical happened. Charles's face transformed. The weariness lifted, replaced by a look of such profound love and gratitude that it moved everyone who witnessed it. He smiled, a real smile, and for a moment the King of England was just a father, warmed by the love of his daughter. It was a moment that spoke louder than any royal decree. It was the culmination of a love story that had begun years ago with a nervous young woman and a daunting prince. It was the story of a bond forged in quiet moments of understanding, strengthened in shared grief, and cemented in the fires of illness. It was the story of how Catherine chose, over and over again, to love the man behind the title. And in that silent, stunned room, as a kiss spoke 1,000 words, the world understood what those closest to them had always known, that Charles and Catherine shared a connection that was rare, precious, and utterly unbreakable. As they walked out of the cathedral together side by side, it was clear that they were not just monarch and princess. They were family, in the truest and deepest sense of the word.